So welcome everybody. We are here today to talk about working with social workers or social service providers. And this training is really designed for attorneys who have social service providers on their defense team to kind of better understand how we can maximize their services and how we can do so ethically and in the best interests of our clients. So we are lucky enough to have some wonderful presenters here who I will introduce in a second, but just a little background. My name is Liz Mustin, and I am the Adult and Youth Criminal Defense Program Supervisor here at the Washington State Office of Public Defense. And in this capacity, I have been working with my colleague, George Yanakis, to help basically with a grant that we got from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which is a federal agency. And through that grant, we've been providing social service providers to the youth defenders in juvenile court in Benton and Franklin counties. That grant is coming to an end now. And so we decided that through that program, we wanted to create some lasting resources that attorneys and social workers in Washington could use to make sure that when we are lucky enough to have a social service provider on our defense team, that we are utilizing them in the right way and making the most of it. So I am going to turn it over soon to my colleagues who I've been working with on this, but first I'll briefly introduce them. This project has really been led by Maren Willins, who is a social worker out of Colorado. And as some of you may know, Colorado has a robust statewide public defense system that has been using pretty systematically social service providers in their defense work for a long time. And so she's been able to take on a leadership role in helping other jurisdictions basically implement this project in different types of areas. So we're really honored and thankful that she's agreed to work with us on this. And then we also have Simmie Baer, who is a longtime Washington defender, who has worked in many different places and capacities in Washington State, including being one of the founders of Team Child. She is passionate about working in juvenile court and protecting the rights of youth who are facing charges in those courts, and has also been in charge of a clinic at Northwestern, I believe, working on that as well. So we are really honored that she was able to work with us on this project as well. And then last but not least, we have Molly Hennessey, who is a social worker who works in King County Department of Public Defense. She is a wonderful social worker who specializes in working with youth, but also lends her services to adult clients as well. So I'm going to turn it over to them. As I do, I would really appreciate if those of you who are here could put your name and the jurisdiction that you primarily practice in the chat, and also just specify if you primarily practice in adult or juvenile court. This is being recorded, so hopefully you have been notified by Zoom of that. But the other just housekeeping thing is that we would be happy to take questions throughout. If you have a question, you could raise your hand. You are welcome to put them in the chat, and I will try and elevate those as they fit into the presentation. But feel free to ask questions throughout, and we will try and get to them as we can. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Maren.
Thank you, Liz. As Liz said, I'm Maren Willins. I have been doing criminal defense-based forensic social work and for 20 years now, 21 years. I started working in an internship in St. Louis, where I went to school at the psychiatric hospital and was asked to join a patient for their court date while they were going through a mental health crisis. So I fell into this a little bit by accident. I was wholly unprepared to assist this client in any sort of meaningful way. I was a glorified babysitter, but at maximum, it sparked an interest in criminal defense-based forensic social work for me. After school, I moved to Colorado, Denver, and I was lucky enough to first start working as one of the first two forensic social workers in the public defender's office. They've grown from having two of us across the state to having at least one social worker involved in each county. After I had my children, I joined the Alternate Defense Council and some of their leadership roles and practicing one-on-one. And they've grown to probably 50 plus forensic social workers across the state, which is great. As I was going further in my career, I was looking for resources and articles and realizing there really was not a book written on criminal defense-based forensic social work. So myself, with Molly as a contributing author and several others, wrote the book. It's been out for about 4 or 5 years now. So if you haven't read it already, I encourage you to do so. And currently I still practice as a forensic social worker in Colorado. I love to teach nationally like this when I can. And I'm also a therapist. So I will pass it on to Simmie to introduce herself. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Simmie Baer. I was just saying I only really recognize one name on the participant list. That's how old I am now. But I was at TDA in Seattle for 20 years. I supervised the juvenile division, and I left there in 2005 to go to Northwestern to run the juvenile clinic there. Then I went to Colorado for a few years and picked up some juvenile life without parole clients there, as well as one here in not here, but in Washington, and a couple in Chicago. And I'm happy to say they're all out. One is on his way out, but the rest are out. And I'm glad you're here for this presentation today, because when I started at TDA in 1985, they had a full-blown social work division. And so I've never worked without social workers, and they're the best things to have available to you. And I'm going to talk more today about how useful they are on your cases to cultivate your client's lifeline from prenatal to present, to get all the facts you need to weave the story of innocence or reduce culpability or release or whatever it is you're asking the court to do. And I hope you all were given the developmental framework for juvenile cases. I'm going to talk about that and how to use it. And those are, when you look at that, you'll be able to see how useful a social worker will be to get all the information you need to tell your client's story effectively. And I hope we're able to do that.
I will introduce myself briefly. My name is Molly Hennessey. I am a Seattle native. I got my start in working in Colorado after I got my MSW at the University of Denver. I focused on working on juvenile life without parole cases, as well as decline and auto decline. And I moved home to Seattle, where I currently practice at ACA, focusing mostly on youth juvenile cases. I'm doing our resentencing cases in our unit, the Bonchke, et cetera, youthfulness-based resentencings. And I also work with young adults and any aged adult in felonies. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Molly. Can you advance to the next slide? I like this graphic because many of us, attorneys, professionals alike, our clients, lay people, think they have an idea of what social workers do. And there's a grain of truth in each of these, but they're all pretty funny to me. So I'm just curious, and you can either pop it in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute yourself and let me know Who is working with a social worker right now? What are you having them do? And if you're not working with social workers, if you feel brave to tell me why not, and whether it's just they're not available to you. So feel free to write that in the chat or just unmute yourself and let us know. Okay, if I don't hear from anybody, I'm going to assume that you're not working with social workers right now. Okay, here's one. Let's see. Looks like some are trying to move into utilizing social workers. Let's see. Looks like there's two, one for the felony team, one for our misdemeanor team. They're helping to line up housing, work on mitigation reports, help clients get hooked up with providers. Oh, dentists taking into custody, all kinds of resources. Thank you. Okay, so it sounds like people might be going outside of their agency to work with social workers, maybe on a provider basis. Okay. Some don't work with social workers. Can somebody explain to me what Team Child is?
Team Child
Oh, you go ahead, Simmie.
I wrote the grant for Team Child in 1995 because I was tired of watching my juvenile clients be held accountable in probation violation hearings for things they have no control over, like why didn't you get your mental health evaluation? Why aren't you in school? Why aren't you getting whatever it is you need that all these agencies outside of the criminal justice system are set up to do for you, but aren't held accountable to you? So it was a way to get civil and criminal law blended together so that when a kid comes into the criminal system, they have lawyers with expertise in the civil system to address education, mental health, housing, all their civil needs at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you, Simmie.
You're welcome.
And it sounds like, some at the federal level, there's 2 social workers working on social histories, helping find treatment, housing, mitigation reports, plea and sentencing mitigation. Sounds like some places there's no funding resources to utilize social workers. Thank you. That's helpful. I thought it would be a mixed group of those who have been working with social workers for a while and those who maybe have not. So we will all try to be mindful of not boring you to tears if you already know it, and hopefully encourage some of you to bug the powers that be to get social workers in your county on your team working with your clients. Next slide, please. Simmie, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. This is one of my favorite quotes from Brian Stevenson, who's a remarkable lawyer who did I was able to see him argue the Graham case in the Supreme Court against life without parole for juveniles. And what it is about youth, when they make the worst mistake of their life, it's not an intentional act and necessarily, it's about their trauma, their disabilities, and their immaturity. And we have to understand everything that's behind that act to be able to explain it to the court or whoever has control over the client's life, that they are more than that act.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So why do we work together? What is criminal defense-based forensic social work? Simply put, we're meeting the client's legal needs and their social work needs together. It's a natural, although at times contentious marriage. The overall goal is always the best legal outcome for our client and incorporating holistic defense. It's not perfect, but it does overall help the client's conclusions and their legal needs. Simmie, do you mind talking a little bit about why you find it important and what value you've seen in working with social workers throughout your legal career?
They're incredible fact collectors for us. And really, that's what our cases are all about, facts, so that we can tell a great story. And we don't have to make anything up. Our clients' lives are full of facts. And the social workers are the experts who can gather those facts in so many different arenas because facts are what move people. Law doesn't move people. You can say self-defense 100 times and everybody has a different idea. But if you full of facts to explain what happened, so everybody has the same picture in their mind, then you move people. And the social workers are the movers that help you do that. They gather all those facts along that lifeline and all those different arenas that help you talk about the trauma, the disabilities, and the immaturity. Because our clients are more immature than a normal teenager because of their trauma, their disabilities. And we have to understand that ourselves to be able to explain why what happened happened. And we can do that. We have to go behind the crime, way behind the crime. And that's what we use our social work teams to do. And they do it so effectively with us because they know a lot of where to go gather those facts beyond what we know. So it's working together that allows us to do it in the best way we can.
Excellent. And as social workers, I'll talk about the skills that we utilize to weave those facts together in a meaningful way, mostly for the court, but also in a powerful, empowering way for the client. First and foremost is rapport building. If I can't connect with the client, I'm not able to do a very good job. And assessing what might be going on, what's getting in the way of them working with you on their legal defense, what's going on at home, what's going on in their lives. Many times I saw some of the counties talking about reentry services and housing. It's pretty hard to focus on what's like with my client in grad school. It's pretty hard to focus what's going on legally with you when you're in a mental health crisis and your medication might be getting adjusted, or you're worried about getting kicked out of the apartment at the end of the month, or you're having trouble finding clean, fresh clothes to go to school. Social workers can help with all of that. There's the nitty-gritty support, like I just mentioned, and there's just the emotional support. I would argue that most of our young clients have never been in trouble with the law before, and that in and of itself is traumatizing if they've gone to a detention center or been moved away from home. Even if it was in their best interest, it's still traumatizing. And while we're not their therapists, we can certainly emotionally support that client. Advocacy, just trying to figure out what's going on with our client and advocate for them or teach them how to advocate for themselves. Resource identification is always a hard one. Across the country, things are underfunded and undersupported. I think your local social workers have a better understanding of what is and is not possible. Psychoeducation is a big one. Sometimes that means I might be educating the attorney I'm working with about some of the trauma responses my client's going through, or some of the mental health symptoms and how that looks in the context of them as a person, and why they may need certain, visual, auditory clues in terms of understanding what's going on in their case. Sometimes that's with the parents. It's across the board, really. Clinical interviewing is always a part of what I do on the everyday. Occasionally, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of this, there's crisis intervention. We are, like Brian Stevenson says, he's a superhero of mine. We're catching our clients probably at one of the worst stages in their life, if not the worst time of their life. Helping our clients skill build, that's part of advocacy, but just the everyday, how do I plan out my day? How do I plan for the future? Is it something as simple as I need a calendar to write down upcoming probation dates or court dates or meeting with my attorney? How do I get there? How much time does it take? All of that. I don't know if you all are doing any defense initiated victim outreach there. There's not a lot here in Colorado, but I think sometimes that would be the goal for all sides when a matter, legal matter happens. Occasionally I testify more because I've been doing it for so long. I am an expert in this arena. Research, as Simmie mentioned, we're pretty good at collecting the facts and becoming an expert in our client. Doesn't always mean much to the judges that don't know us or the DAs that don't know us if I can't back it up with research. So I have, piles and piles electronically of trauma-informed care research, developmental research, disability research, anything that's going to happen to help our clients. And, all leading up to mitigation, I want to help your client get the best legal deal and explain a little more in the context of them as a human and their life, how they got to this point and how we're going to move forward. Next slide, please.
Okay, I am going to talk a little bit about how to put those skills into some tangible work product for the attorneys and members of the legal team. So the social worker mitigation specialist will be taking notes, based on their visits and contacts with the client. And these can be really important to stay in touch with your social worker mitigation specialist about, especially if for people who work with social workers outside of their own agency and may not have a case management system that you're easily able to kind of look that stuff up. It's really good to keep in contact about what's going on with your client, what any updates might be. And you can also kind of turn those interactions into mitigation. An example I like to give is sometimes our youth clients may not want to engage with the JPC or attend meetings or things like that, but maybe they will meet with me. And so we can kind of report to the court and the judge, okay, they may have a contentious relationship with the JPC, the juvenile probation officer, or whoever the case worker is, but they are engaging, with the defense social worker, and they are making meetings and they are showing up. And so that's kind of an example of how the social worker can really be an asset. It's worth having a conversation about what kinds of things the social worker should and maybe should not document. This can come up, really with any age, but a lot of times they will tell you things that maybe we don't want to put in writing. And so it's worth having a conversation about what should and should not go into notes, and maybe like some words that you can kind of cue in kind of a conversation. For example, like client expressed a story about such and such, and that's like a code word that might trigger a memory about. So you remember the conversation, but you may not memorialize it. Records and identification and review. So I could do a whole training on records. I feel like it's an art and something that we use social workers in our office for a lot. And I think it's a great way to, if you do have access to someone, to really capitalize on. Throughout the clinical interviewing process and just getting to know your client, you will identify different places to get records from. And depending on your case, for example, like a decline, auto decline, a really serious case where mitigation is going to be the focus, it's great to get a head start on that. And social workers can be an excellent asset. So in our office, sometimes the social workers may identify the places the records should be sought, and someone else, whether that's a paralegal or that social worker, might do the actual requesting. But that can be really, really important for developing mitigation as well as working with an expert. And depending on the case, you may be able to start really early and get things like birth records, or I know records from DCYF can take like 6 to 9 months sometimes to receive. So getting a really early start on that, and especially if that's going to be a need in the case and something the social worker is going to be asked to do, it's really important for the attorney to communicate that as soon as possible, and what the process might be, and whether that's going to be delegated to someone else, or if it's the social worker's responsibility. But they can be a huge asset in identifying and also reviewing. So another way is the social worker might look at records with a different eye, a different lens than the attorney, and may be able to pick out themes or see kind of how things evolve on a timeline. And so I review records a lot and will send my notes to the team. Sometimes we get asked to send them to make a outline for an expert to maybe cut down on some expert hours since they bill at those high rates. And so can be a great way to utilize social worker. And then reports. So we have a few listed here: sentencing, mitigation, biopsychosocial. Those can often be kind of interchangeably used. And so really communicating ahead of time with the social worker what the goal is and what the ask is. Is this a mitigation report for negotiation, or do you have a therapeutic court in mind as an ask, or is this something that will be used down the line at sentencing? It's really important to kind of have a real intentional conversation about what the goal will be, and that will help the social worker be able to kind of gather information. And of course, they're using their own kind of clinical opinion, but to have kind of an idea of what the ultimate goal is and what the client's goal is. And also just kind of, again, going back to what kind of case it is and depending on the need. In our office, more time, the better. So biopsychosocials, those are typically reports where we're interviewing the client multiple times, their family, collateral contacts. We're getting records, as many records as we can to be able to intertwine into our report and our conclusion. And so being really transparent about the timeline is so important, because going back to records, that can be a big stall if a client is like duly involved and maybe has a long child protection history. So I think the more time, the better if that's available. But sometimes it's not, and you have a sentencing hearing or an upcoming decline hearing. And so communicating again what the best case scenario would be and what information you're hoping to get. Sometimes that could be a few interviews with a client and maybe calling a parent and writing as much of a narrative as you can. And maybe you don't have time to get records, but just being really transparent with the social worker about the needs of that. And our office does a ton of release planning. So that is something the judges almost expect, at least in King County. So we will write out a release plan that will outline housing, school, any referrals to community agencies. And I have a colleague that calls them success planning. So you can really get creative with how you want to do the outline, but that can be a great way, especially if it's kind of a contested release or something that, if it's in juvenile court, like the probation officer is not in agreement with, and so they're not really doing any referrals or doing any release planning, can be an excellent way to utilize the social worker. And so the next two, genograms and ecomaps, those are things that we learn about in social work school that may not be terms everyone's familiar with, but a genogram is essentially a family tree. This is something I get requested to complete a lot, and this one is kind of fun because it's really customizable. You can make it about a client's just biological family. You can use it to show generational themes like substance use, mental health, incarceration, domestic violence. You can show all of it. But gang involvement, if I didn't say that one already, that one can be really common. And I love doing them with clients, like as a social worker, because it's a great way to, it's like a less invasive way of asking questions. I have like some of my youth fill them out with me. And a lot of times they are just internally for the team, but especially for us visual people, it's a great way to get information and to also kind of see some of these mitigation themes or kind of develop them. And we'll show examples of these coming up too. An eco map is similar, but this kind of shows a youth or young person client, their network. And so these can be, and their relationship to their network. So these could be friendships, things like a job, or they can be kind of bigger or even like macro things. So this is a great way, especially to do with your client, because some of the answers may surprise you. It's a way to outline relationships and whether those are contentious, strained, positive, to really understand who your client is connected with or the things they're connected to. And it's again just a good way to kind of give your client a voice and let them like participate in the interviewing process. Timeline is another great visual. This can be something that the that is used in a mitigation report, or it could be something kind of internal, but it's just a way, again, to put visually out like dates or the order in which things happened. Sometimes it's one way to kind of write stuff out, how it happens, but seeing a timeline of different events can be a great way to show a prosecutor or a judge, what happened in a person's critical years. And so finally, there's testimony. I don't know if testimony is as common. I think I can at least speak with our agency that we often come to court and will make a presentation, especially at a bond hearing or a release hearing or sentencing hearing. But I think it is more common to use like outside experts for expert testimony. But presenting in court, a lot of times I just go to court and will sit in the audience, even if I'm not presenting, just as a show of support. We can also sit up at counsel table at times to help ease the client's nerves or different things. So that can be a great way to utilize just another defense team member, especially if it's something that we've developed a great rapport with the client, can be a great asset in court.
And if I could interject real quick, somebody asked about mandatory reporting. We have several slides on sort of ethical dilemmas and questions around that. So if you can just hold that thought, we will certainly get to it. And what Molly was inferring in some of the visit notes, a lot of times an attorney does not want me to take notes on the incident itself. I am allowed, certainly encouraged and allowed to ask about it because it's obviously relevant. But if I were to ever testify, my notes might be open to being subpoenaed. Honestly, that's never happened in my 20 plus years, but I think that's a more real example of what you might not want me to include in writing in my notes. Go ahead, Molly.
Next slide. Okay, so here is an example of an eco map. You can see the client is at the center. It looks like a parent, Frank, is also noted on there. And you can see there's kind of a key over to the right. And so this is just a great activity to really understand what is important to your client, where their kind of areas of intervention may be. So looks like some substance use. I know with a lot of our youth clients, internet or access to gaming can be kind of a contentious rule or boundary in the home. And so this just helps the defense team really see what is involved in our client's life, what they've identified as positives or negatives, and just a great visual aid. Next.
And if anybody's ever seen Inside Out, they do a great rendition of sort of the communities affecting the little girl, Riley, and how some things fall away, some things get strengthened, some things get shaky. I mean, it's a great visual of basically an eco map. This is a timeline that I had made for a client some years ago who was 17. It was the first time he had ever been in trouble with the law. He was a very quiet young man. And I don't know about you. I have a 15-year-old boy. They don't always like to look straight at you and talk to you. And so for me, it is helpful to have something for us to do. As I got to know him a little bit, I learned that the majority of his family was involved in the criminal justice system, to the point where he didn't realize how involved that he had been in 12 homes already by the time he was 17, and they had 31 police contacts. It was a part of the family culture that he hadn't really looked at yet, but was obviously very relevant. Mostly it was dad who was in and out of prison. The chaos of having dad in and out was really illustrated there. Mom was gone for a good chunk of time when he was itty bitty. Grandma was not in trouble ever legally, but didn't gain guardianship of him until he was 15 years old. So he had already had these years of, certainly he loves and cares about his mom and dad, but how that influenced him and affected him. It was many conversations into our professional relationship before I even learned that grandpa was in the picture and what was going on with grandpa. So this initially helped our client put into context how much police contact there had been in his life and the chaos it created. And then I do remember the attorney blew this up as a big visual for part of court. So what started as helpful for myself was helpful for the client, helpful for their case. Next slide, please. This is a genogram. It's not a very good one, to be honest, that I made a while ago, but what Molly was referring to about a family tree. The thing I really like about these family trees is it can certainly be added on to. I don't know about you, but when I'm first meeting a client, it's a little hard for me to keep track of everybody. And it's much better for me to do it in a visual to see how everybody's connected, who's connected, whether it's biological or not. I don't really care, but who's important to this kiddo. I more recently have been working with a client for maybe 4 or 5 months, and I knew 2 of the siblings. I had no idea she had an older sister, and I did not get informed of this until they got into a physical fight. So some of that just isn't always in the forefront of our clients' minds. So this is a good way for us to take our client through the details of their family, who means what to them. For this client, Jamie's the client, is a transgender male to female. She was young when I first met her. And I think probably the strongest relationship she had, if I remember correctly, was actually with her stepmom, who wasn't technically married to dad, but that was probably the most supportive person emotionally in her life and the most stable person in her life. So that was important for us to kind of dissect. Let's see, next slide, please. There's a lot of overlap with our roles and sort of what our duties are. This is all pretty similar. Occasionally I'm asked to be an expert, but that's pretty rare. All of this we have covered, but it does feel like we wear many different hats. Molly, is there anything that speaks to you that needs clarification for Washington specific work at all?
I would say I would say wear all of these hats. And as far as like the word expert, I would say we're utilized more as like an internal expert, but we also, I know, help consult with the attorneys a lot on identifying experts. So we may have a perspective about specifically like whether a youthfulness expert would be helpful or if neuropsychological testing would be helpful. Sometimes attorneys will come and just say like, I have all these facts and like, what do you think? Or like they had an IEP or the parent is reporting X, Y, and Z. What would we need to do to get like a documentation for a referral for Department of Developmental Disabilities? Just different things. And so I think we are an internal expert. We help the attorneys figure out who to maybe contract with as an outside expert for sure. And we also do a lot of prep work for the experts. So often providing like reports for experts, which I should have covered in my other slide, but a lot of times we can provide a great like little primer for an expert for the client that so we may do the family interviews and put that in a report so that the expert can kind of rely on that. That would be the only thing I would add.
That's great. Thank you. Let's go to our next slide. And Simmie's going to talk about the history of criminal defense-based forensic social work.
In case law, there's not a lot of history of working with social workers, but what's really important and what I want to point out is starting with Roper v. Simmons. And I'll give you the side and I'll give you the side of Miller. The amicus briefs in Roper, the AMA put together an amicus brief that explains everything we could possibly talk about who youth are and why, and it's what really made the Supreme Court do the rulings they made. And the language in these cases is also so beautiful. It talks about how heinous crime committed by a youth is nowhere near as heinous as committed by an adult, and how youth are driven by, they're peer driven, they can't foresee consequences because they don't have a frontal lobe gelled yet, and that they are natural risk takers. That's not new, and all this has been around forever. Youth talking to police and giving statements. There's a lot of wonderful language about how youth cannot stand up to the police. There's a whole power difference. So it just didn't all come about in Roper. It's been there, and it's so worth looking at. But definitely read the amicus briefs. And the site for Roper is 543 US 551. And that's 2005. And for Miller, it's the American Psychological Association, and that amicus is in 567 US 460 from 2012. And the National Association of Social Workers is part of that first one in Roper. And I can't stress enough how important it is to read those and have those handy, because judges will always say, if you say, well, our kid is special ed, or our kid has trauma, they'll say, yeah, well, I have a kid that's in special ed and they didn't murder anybody. I mean, they love to say that. And you have to be able to explain why your child's wagon had more deficits and risks than assets, and what those are. And that's how you use the social worker to explain what was in their wagon and how it affected their behavior. And if you look at the handout, the developmental framework, what's so important about that is you don't see an IQ test on there anywhere. That doesn't tell you anything about who your client is. But it really explains what it means to be immature and how that affects their thinking at the time of the offense, during police questioning, and assisting you. And if you look at trauma retards development. It stops it. So if you have a client that's experienced trauma, they are way far behind other kids their age in their ability to function in many, many ways. And you have to understand that. And that's what those amicus briefs will help you understand. And looking at this developmental framework, that's really how you want to put your case together, is not by talking about IQs and psychological evaluations, but by using all these things Molly has just talked about and Maren has just talked about. That so much more helps you explain who your client is and who they were at the time of the offense and why they may have made the decisions they made at the time of the offense. And if you also, I want to encourage you to look at and Google Abigail Baird, B-A-I-R-D. Until their late 20s. And her stuff is amazing. She's hilarious. She was a comedian in Australia, and then she decided to be a brain scientist, so came here. But one thing that I like the most about her work is her ability to talk about how the saying that something is not a good decision as quickly as adults or as quickly as other kids who don't have the risk and fewer assets in their wagon. What it may take one kid no time to say bad idea to eat shards of glass. Other kids, it took them 5 minutes to figure out it's a bad idea because their brain paths are so gummed up with trauma and disabilities that they can't get to that decision to not do something. And they shouldn't be held accountable in the same way as other kids. That's why this developmental framework is so important for each individual kid to look at each of these things and get the facts in each of these areas using your social work and those things that they have just talked about to help you get to these facts.
Thank you, Simmie. Yeah, for some reason, Simmie, you're dropping in and out a little bit. So hopefully everybody got the bulk of that. So how do we work together? It's a big question, right? This slide's really about what's best practices. I know not everybody has a social worker on the team or even in their office or even accessible, but this is through my years of work and the book writing, what I have found to be the best way to do it. So communication is really key. The attorney is the lead. We're all a team with various roles. That's including the client as a member of the team. As Molly alluded to earlier, let's set expectations at the beginning of our work together. Some clients, they don't need a full-blown report. Some clients just really need help finding how to get enrolled in online school because they got kicked out of their school for the next year. So this is the priority. Some need to find out how to get in touch with the family. It can be as simple as that, or it can be as bulky as really getting the records. What do we think clinically might be going on with this client? What expert would I recommend you hire to help this client explain how we got to this point, and then writing a full mitigation report. So I think the more you set those expectations at the beginning, the better. What topics you want the social worker to include or not include. Maybe if it is one of these that we just want to get a bit of a Band-Aid going on, I hate to say that, but sometimes that's what is needed in a case. Let's do that. Or I had alluded to before, just not talking about the facts of the offense. That's okay. I can still do my job without writing all of that down. I consider myself an arm of the attorney, so I'm covered under the same client attorney privilege that the attorney is under, and I explain that to the client and when we're all meeting as a team. That's not to say that my client, if they are having harmful thoughts or thoughts of harming themselves, I'm not going to safety plan and help them come to a way of handling that internally on the team and to keep our clients safe. But that's how I like to explain it, so they know that the attorney is the lead and that we're really working towards the best legal outcome. If we don't have our client working with us, what's the point? We need to have them at the table as much as possible. That's with team meetings, all working together when we can. And this requires more checking in, whether we're all meeting together to see the client or meeting to have a check-in at court or simple email, phone call, whatever makes most sense for each person on the team. And things change. We might find out information that we had no idea about before, or let's be honest, sometimes our clients pick up another charge when we're working with them, and we need to address that. So, expectations might need to be revisited, or they're offered probation and we need to figure out the best ways. My report's no longer needed, but how can I work with the client on talking about those skill buildings and advocacy to help them be successful on probation? Any other thoughts on that, Simmie?
No, that's good.
Okay. All right, next slide, please. So there's 5, and I don't expect people outside of therapists to really know this. A lot of teachers are learning it. I think anybody who works with youth are starting to learn it. Trauma-informed care is a whole course that you can take in college, in graduate school. There's continuous training on that. It's much bigger than this, so I just want to preface. However, that doesn't mean us as professionals cannot be mindful of this when we work with our youth, that I would say the majority of the youth we work with have trauma in their history. And so we want to work to keep them safe, to feel safe, to know that we are trustworthy adults, to explain how they have choice in what's going to happen with them in the future. They don't have as much power as maybe they want to, or we would like them to, but there is choice in what comes next, and collaboration, that you really are trying to work together to help them. And overall, if we can empower our clients to make a good choice, or to engage in therapy, or to go to school and try a new subject and not steal crap, I mean, we've done our job. One of the best questions that I can ask each of you to ask your client when you first meet them, and this is something I do with every client, I say, oh, hi, Simmie, I'm pleased to meet you. My name's Maren. You know, in your file, it says that your first name's Simmie. What would you like me to call you? There's nothing more empowering than them choosing, well, not choosing, they feel a certain way, what they should be called, and that we recognize this. This leads into our pronouns. This leads into a little bit of safety and trustworthiness moving forward. It's a simple question. You know, your file says this. What would you like me to call you? Okay, next. Go ahead.
I would just like to say, I try to come back to these principles, especially with our most difficult and challenging clients, the ones that frustrate us the most, the ones we maybe find are self-sabotaging or are challenging to work with. I really like to come back to these principles and look at it through the lens of like, what is X, Y, and Z behavior? Like, what need is that meeting? You know, them refusing visits, what need is that meeting? And I think when we come back to looking at through a trauma-informed lens, we can understand our clients and try to pivot. And I think, again, a plug for working with a social worker, they can be a great consultant in addressing maybe some of the challenges, communication challenges, or just kind of be a liaison, because there's something a little bit different about having a relationship with your lawyer and having a relationship with the social worker. We often can come in and do a little more rapport building and casual conversations. And so can just be a great asset with some clients who are maybe difficult to work with.
Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, it's really hard to be a teenager. I haven't been one in a very long time, but I remember the feelings I had with it, whether they were rational or not, it didn't matter. I remember what it was like. So it's hard to be a teenager. It's hard to be a teenager in this day and age. It's especially hard to be a teenager when you've had significant trauma in your life, as I would say most of our clients do. Next slide, please. So how do I do this in the context of an attorney and utilizing the social worker on my team? And this is really hard across the board, and I recognize this. And again, this is best practices that I will have Simmie and Molly jump in, and anybody from the audience. I'd love to hear your feedback. But I think for me, because I'm very task oriented, following your client at their own pace can feel really hard. And it goes both ways. You know, I really want to get to the meat of what's going on. And sometimes if a client's telling me about the trauma that happened when they were 8 years old and it's sexual trauma, and this is the first time I'm meeting with them, I'm going to pump the brakes a little bit. Not that it's not important, but you don't know me yet. Let's get to know each other a little bit more. And then I definitely want to hear about this, and I definitely want to come back to this. This call follows sort of the safety part of keeping your client safe. Setting clear goals. I oftentimes, and I know Molly does this too, you know, need to go through maybe a survey with them to assess their mental health, or go through something given to me by the attorney in terms of their family history. That's hard, or they might just not want to do it. So I do, you know, they're still kids. I do try to reward in the way that I can, whether it's they tell me a little bit about what music they like. Maybe I can download some of those songs and we can listen to them at the end of our meeting. I don't know about there's a couple facilities there that I can buy a soda or some chips or some candy and bring it into our meeting. Or there's a lot that have games that I can use there to play with my client. Even when they're a teenager, they still want to connect in a different way with trusted adults. And accepting some resistance. I don't know, I think on a regular basis, resistance is part of being a teenager, and it's going to be stronger with somebody who's trying to protect themselves and protect what's happened to them around an adult they don't know yet. I'm always trying to work from a strengths-based perspective, and like, I don't know much about anime. I find out my client loves anime. Please teach me about it. It might seem frivolous, but in this way, I'm teaching my client that they know things and they know things I don't know. And I'm interested in it, whether I am or not. I'm going to pretend I am, but I can usually find interest in something. But this is going to be empowering to them later down the road when I'm asking some harder questions to them. Safety. I'm always mindful of keeping my client physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe. I'm going to be paying attention to what their body is doing. If they're feeling nervous, how that might show up. This is always in the back of my head. So this leads on to what not to do. And I do want some more feedback from the attorneys as we go through this, because I think we are taught differently in school. In terms of trauma-informed care, I don't want to push my client too much. I want there to be a natural flow, even though it might seem slow, but I don't want I'm never going to push somebody to talk about their trauma if they're not ready to talk about it. I never want to ignore, well, I do want to sometimes, but I try not to ignore my clients' goals. An example of this is I have a very young female client, and she is doing online school, and developmentally and socially, emotionally, I know this is not the best fit for her. I want to see her back in school, but for whatever reasons right now, she is not ready to be in in-person school. I'm not going to push that right now, and I'm not going to just force her into in-person school. We'll stay the course with online school. This one's a good, interesting one, the do not touch. I shake hands with my client, and that's it. I think some of you who've been working with social workers probably find that we have different boundaries when it comes to physical touch. Let Simmie talk about it a little bit more, but I know in school you're taught to humanize and touch your client maybe in the context of court, because we are trying to present them as a human being. But if I don't know what's happened to my client and what I represent to them, or what a male represents to them, I'm not going to touch them. It's not appropriate. That's a boundary that I set, because I do not want to re-traumatize them. Molly and Simmie, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think everything you went through is exactly the way a lawyer should talk to their clients too. It's the same kind of interviewing structure and protocol, I would say, for a lawyer too. Those same things are all the important things to follow. And in terms of touching your client, you definitely talk to them about it, whether they want to be touched or not, and if it's okay, and because it's part of preparing them for court. And what's going to happen, and you should always be doing that so that nothing surprises them, and also so that they feel comfortable and giving you information so nothing surprises you. And that's why it's all about these things and spending the time, so that they don't just tell something comes out, a fact comes out in court that they never told you because they weren't comfortable enough yet with you. And it's so important to not go into a conversation with your client in detention or anywhere and say, oh, I only have 5 minutes. That immediately shuts them down, because 5 minutes is a long time. Just start talking. And there's ways you can do that. There's ways you can end it and say, and I'll be back, in tomorrow at this time, but never make promises you can't keep. That's the worst thing you could do. If you say you're going to be back on a certain day, a certain time, you have to do that. And it's also important to go in at the beginning with your social worker, your social service provider, so you can cover all the groundwork and talk about what they'll be talking more about with the social worker and what they should save and talk to you more about. But that's also shows the importance of them getting as comfortable with you as with the social worker.
There's a question in the chat that I want to address, and it's not a silly question. It's a good question about, is there ever, from Katie, is there ever a need to touch your client apart from shaking hands? Usually not, but yes. I more recently have a client, he's charged with murder. I think it was very important when my attorney holds him on the shoulder in court when he is pleading guilty to what he's pleading guilty to. The people in the room see him as a murderer. And I think we see him as our client. We see him as somebody's child. We see him as somebody's father. I see him as a young man still. I don't see him as an adult. He's 24. So I think the touch on the shoulder in court, she did talk to him about it before, is very humanizing. It's also very grounding. Some of these, especially in court, can be traumatizing in their own way. They can be depersonalizing for our client. There's been times when, like Molly said, I am invited to sit next to my client because there's so much involved. And it's not always that we're touching, but I'll have a pen and I can write something to this client and they can write something back. If they need to write notes or doodle, they need to be able to do that. There's been an occasional, and this is rare, and this would more be the social worker, and I only say this because I am also a therapist, where I can tell the client might be disassociating a little bit. And so it can be very grounding for them. For me, I don't always hold hands, but I will hold their hand a little bit more than a handshake to bring them back to the present moment. And I do something that's talking. People, anybody can do this. Anybody dealing with anxiety can benefit from this. Talking about, the 5 senses. Currently, what do you see? What do you smell? Is there anything you taste? Is there anything you hear? Is there anything you feel? And that can bring somebody back to the present. Again, that's rare, but I do think there are situations where, mostly in a court situation, it's helpful to get your client back to the present or ground them a little bit or just show a little bit of support. Let's see. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a lot of the research that I include, whether I'm talking or really in every report. If I don't quote something from Dr. Larry Steinberg, I'm not doing my job. He's one of the leaders in brain development and adolescent development. He will also email you back if you email him, which is rare. And then, I'll let Simmie talk about the others because you put a lot of these in.
The Galt Center used to be the National Juvenile Justice Center, and they have an amazing resource bank and also a great email line that you would, if you represent youth all the time or a lot, you want to get on. But as I said, their resources are remarkable. The Haywood Burns Institute does a lot of research on disproportionality. They put out a report not too long ago on the over-probating of youth of color, which is fantastic. And I've used that quite a bit to talk about why kids should not be on probation and why it's more harmful and less restorative. And then again, Abigail Baird. And then there's a National Geographic article that's quite wonderful that talks about how if teenagers weren't risk takers, peer driven, and were were able to foresee consequences, which they can't, our species would not go on because we keep our kids in the nest for 18 years, and that's longer than any other species. Birds have to fledge in weeks. And so what they're saying is if there were not peers saying, come on, let's do this, let's ride behind a bus, let's hold on to the bumper, let's do this, let's not even we can't even think about the worst thing that could happen. They'd never get off the couch and fledge. So it's really, we owe teenagers for all these, what we think are deficits, to continue the human species. And so I thought that was a great way of looking at all of the things that are addressed in the US Supreme Court cases, that they're risk takers, peer driven, and can't foresee consequences. This is really explains why organically and developmentally. And then Marty Baer, of course. And the other ones are ones that were put on here by Maren and Molly. So it's just a great list of resources.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I had to give a quick hug. Policies. Now we'll get into more the nitty-gritty of what how attorneys are trained and how social workers are trained. Overall, the social work values include service, social justice, client dignity, importance of relationships, and competency. You know, from my view, that's largely overlapping with the values that attorneys enter in through. Next slide, please. The way I approach each case, even when it is, you know, a smaller, just we need some resources kind of a case, which never is small because we all know how hard it is to come by some of our resources, is from a past, present, future approach. You know, really looking at where my client came from, what was going on in their history. Present, I mean, how did they get to this point where they may or may not have been involved in a crime, and what does that look like? And then future, especially with the youth, because their capacity to change is so astronomical compared to adults. It's not that adults don't have that capacity, it's just so big for our youth. You know, what resources can I help put in place to move on from this, really with the mind of alternative sentencing, you know, and that's through team collaboration. What's getting in the way of some of these resources and movement? Is there an expert that needs to be part of this? And always, always, always cultural humility. That's one thing. Yes, I've been to school, but if there's a training available on anything related to cultural humility, I want to take that. Same with trauma. We know a lot. We don't know everything. There's always more to learn. And Molly already kind of explained about, you know, that we're the internal expert. We're not necessarily the expert that you want to testify, which is fine. Next slide, please. So ethical conflicts, my overall sort of thought on this is it's naive to think that they won't happen, but I also want you to know it really doesn't happen that often. In the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, yes, it does happen, but it's certainly not a weekly thing. It's maybe a couple times a year, if that thing. And this goes back to best practices of talking about it at the onset, know and develop a protocol, whether that be on each individual team. For myself, it's a little bit easy because the agencies that I contract with, they already have it in place, largely written by myself, but still it's already written, and then consulting with it. And we can go on to some more examples. Simmie, did you have any thoughts on this? I'm seeing like how often they've happened in your line of work.
I think you're right. I don't think that I really can't think of times that it's broken down to where something terrible has happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
And part of it is you always have to stay in communication with your team.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I just an example, I even remember when I took my test to be a licensed clinical social worker, the answer that was right to my client is suicidal or expresses suicidal thoughts. The correct answer on the test was always call the police. That's not the correct answer in practice. And I was always like, okay, so if I want to get a good passing grade, I have to answer this way. But in reality, I almost never would have to do that for a client. And I've worked at a suicidal hotline. And I just want to bring that up. Like, just because things are written a certain way, does that mean how it is in practice? And we're going to get into like some specific details. Next slide, please.
And we're trying to move away from engaging police in those situations now because of how harmful that is.
Yes, 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 yes.
Good point.
And again, so this is an example of a protocol when ethical dilemmas arise. This is best practices. This is how I practice. I do fully understand that this isn't always the case across the board. It all starts with team meeting and consultation. Say my client has a report of abuse. I am not going to call the police. I'm going to get with my attorney and the investigator and the client, whoever else is on the team. We're going to have a conversation about this and what it means and how we're going to move forward. Some agencies have a handbook of how to address each ethical dilemma. And the next step would be supervision. We're lucky here. We have at least two other I was the interim supervisor. I've supervised a lot of the the new social workers here in Colorado. And we have two with the alternate defense counsel. If we can't come to some sort of safety plan or next best moves, we can utilize the supervisor, whether that be, Liz, George, Molly, whoever is in your agency. That's a good way to do it. I know at minimum, there's another kind of phone a friend I can reach out to. I know a lot of social workers, and if I'm stuck on something, I know a lot of attorneys too. There's always somebody, while appreciating client confidentiality, that I can talk some issues through. So that's my example of best case. So let's go to the next slide. And the three of us are really going to pick through, again, what doesn't happen often, but does certainly happen, some examples. I think the biggest one is harm to self, especially working with youth. Certainly as a clinical professional, I can start to pick apart when somebody is self-harming, when somebody has real suicidal ideations, or when somebody is just, has a plan. All scary, all important to pay attention to, but I am certainly not going to call the police when somebody tells me that they're having thoughts of harming themselves. Best case scenario, I'm really going to talk to that client to see about what are they thinking about. Do they have any means of hurting themselves? What does that mean to them? What does it provide for them? Do they have a history of suicide attempts? It's all important. It sounds scary, but it doesn't scare me to talk about this with the client because this is what they're feeling. Like at the onset, I always say, what we talk about is confidential, but you do need to assume I'm going to talk to your attorney about it because we're all in this together and we care about you. And this is a prime example of, I'm not going to leave that client in our context of meeting until I know that they can be safe. My next step is immediately to call the attorney and talk about what I've been told, what my worries are, what our safety plan is. Our safety plan may be as simple as I'm going to call you in an hour to see if you're feeling the same way. If you are, me, the attorney, the investigator, somebody's going to come back. There's a lot of steps before I have to involve anybody of consequence outside the team. And the truth is, I've never done this on any of my forensic teams. Harm to others. I mean, I'd say half of our clients have already engaged in this in somehow, so it's a little bit moot. I don't know if Simmie or Molly, you have any case examples you'd want to talk about?
I have had this come up, and I would say we just kind of take a similar approach. It's really, I don't think it's ever happened in my practice where I wasn't able to kind of get to an understanding with the client and either, whether it was like the nugget of what their statement was that they were frustrated and just like talking it out kind of helped. But I found that most of my clients will contract for safety or will make a plan with me. But I have had quite a few clients say, well, I may do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, well, we need to talk that through a little bit more. And then, of course, I always notify my supervisor and the attorney about kind of what happened and what they may view the next steps as being.
Thank you. I think child abuse is the one that everybody is afraid of. The truth is, many of our clients have already been a victim in their history, and we might learn more and we might know that it's not been reported. I kind of handle it the same way. I try to flesh it out with my client of what they know and what they don't know, what they're afraid of, what's been reported. in my 20 plus years doing this, I've never had to call DHS to report child abuse. My clients, yes, they're young, but they're also have some, empowerment in their life, and that maybe I don't report it, but I know they have a therapist. Maybe they need to talk to this therapist about it, or there's a GAL involved. I find a lot of times I'm not the only one who knows about this, and I'm not the one who needs to report. So I try to, with the clients, at the table, talk about what does this mean and where do we go from here. I don't know about Simmie and Molly, if you ever had cases where you felt like you needed to report, but it's the same sort of thing. I'm going to talk to the attorney. I'm going to talk to my supervisor. The good thing is I'd say the majority of my kid clients here have a GAL. So, they're looking out for my client's best interests, and they're the mandatory recorder on the team.
Right.
Yeah, I would say I have called with clients a few times after clearing it with the attorney. I've sat with a client, we've called together. They, or they just are sitting with me and I kind of make the report on their behalf, but it's always, always, always with their permission. Sometimes they want to call and they want to try to seek services, and sometimes, at least in Washington, calling DCYF will initiate like some voluntary services or a chins if they maybe don't want to go home or they're in fear of going home. So I do think there are times, I would say I've never made a report without the client's consent ever. That really hasn't come up. I think if it has, it's always been in discussion with the attorney, and it comes back to not breaking confidentiality and not doing something outside the client's stated wishes. But I'm having a hard time thinking of an example of that. The most recent ones are calling alongside my youth clients.
I'd say that's my experience too, is helping them initiate what it is they want to see happen.
I like, Molly, what you brought up, and Liz, I note your comment that I think is really important. Child protective service has really changed. They don't just take children away, even though sometimes they should. They do it from a more clinical approach these days, a more voluntary approach. Certainly that's not the case for everything. But I guess my example, Liz, was commenting that it doesn't sound like there's as many GALs involved in Washington as there might be here. So that being said, a more recent investigation, I don't know what is going on, but I know my client and her mom, it comes to being physical with one another at times. I don't know what it is. It's more of a feeling because neither one is telling me anything. They have a GAL involved who, quite frankly, isn't very good. And I don't trust him to do anything. So it's as if there is no GAL involved. What it has come to, because I want my client to be safe and I don't want my client to be hit, and I don't want my client in a position to have to defend themselves with an adult. They're still a child. It's come to the point where there's been a family therapist involved. And I know if I'm seeing, honestly, anybody could get this sense from them. You do not have to be a clinical professional to know something icky is going on in that home. That I'm so glad that this is still, it initiated this voluntary DHS referral where family therapy is a part of her probable probation and consequences from criminal delinquency court for my young client. And everything that Molly said, I'm not going to do anything without my client knowing and the attorney knowing. And the more we can empower our clients to advocate for themselves, although so hard, that's what Molly's talking about. So hopefully that answers some more question, but that's a big one. And I think that's the one that everybody's scared of, and unfortunately is still epidemic in our culture. Triangulation is important to know on teams. I'm sure we've all experienced it. I know that if I'm working on a team with Simmie and she's the attorney and I'm the social worker, and my client's telling me how great I am and how Simmie's really not doing this, that, and the other, I very well know that the client is saying the same thing to Simmie about how terrible of a job I'm doing and how wonderful she is, and she's the only one who can do this. When that happens, team meeting, the professionals need to come into the room to talk to the client about, we have to work together, or it's not going to work. Manipulation. Do either of you have a good example of manipulation? I think all of our clients are very capable, ourselves included. It's something to be mindful of, and I would go back to some of that trauma response stuff of, why is my client doing this? What does this mean? Probably involving all the professionals if possible, but really getting to, is the client trying to protect themselves? Are they bored? Are they scared? What's going on in the facility? What's going on at home? There's a lot of different reasons our clients are possibly trying to manipulate a situation. Unprofessionalism. We kind of, like I mentioned a minute ago, we all have worked with a variety of professionals who are not as professional or competent at their job. If I'm not their boss, it's not really my job to correct their behavior. But if it's within the team, back to team meetings and having more uncomfortable talks about what the situation is. I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, so back to the touching, I only offer a handshake. If somebody's having a panic attack, I might do more than that, only because I feel comfortable doing that. I wouldn't expect that of other professionals unless they did. I've worked with some attorneys who maybe use like honey and sweetie and sort of terms of endearment that I don't feel comfortable with. I think it's confusing for kids. I'm not their friend. I'm not their mother. I care about them in a professional sense. There might be an opportunity to talk about that, or I might just have to accept that this is how this attorney tries to connect with kids. I've even had it where and I did not say anything because there was nothing I could do really, where, there was a magistrate that just really acts like the kid's friend, and that makes me feel very uncomfortable. I think it's very unprofessional, and I think it's confusing for kids. But that's a situation where I'm certainly not going to talk to the judge about that. That's not appropriate. The attorney, maybe. Sexual misconduct. Unfortunately, this will probably happen in everybody's career, whether you see it or are on the receiving end of it. In the context of our clients, some of them have been through stuff that they don't always know how to act. One thing I know Molly and I have talked about in our professional talks is, especially with my young man, but really any clients, I have a general rule of hands on the table. I know it's the thing to sag your pants and to some boys rest their hands in their pants or whatnot. But when you're meeting with me, we're going to keep our hands on our table. Anything else with that, ladies?
Just being open if the social worker you're working with comes to you with a concern about that, being open to kind of making accommodations for them, or being understanding if something happens.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know that this was a sexual misconduct, but I've had a few instances where if the clients come to the office, I've had a client follow me. Obviously, that made me very uncomfortable. I don't know what their intentions are. After a while, I think they were confused about what a professional relationship was. But I need to pay attention to that. And I did talk to the attorney, and together we talked to this client about how that's not appropriate. And if that continues, you don't need to have me on the team. You're entitled to an attorney, but you're certainly not entitled to me. So I think the more you can, have an ally in your office or on the team, it's uncomfortable. And unfortunately, it does happen. And we need to be open and respectful and help each other professionally to muddle through it sometimes. Client's free will. This is sort of what I was talking about with my young client who's so young and doing online school and not learning in what I think is the best way. But is that the sword I'm going to die on in this case? No. That might be an issue later down the road, but it's not affecting as much. Oh, okay. Questions. And then involving the media, that's only happened once to me. You can go to the questions. That's only happened once for me. And I just, did the wrote no comment. We'll move on. So any questions, anybody? I know we've talked and talked and talked. Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I'm going to make sure we didn't miss anything.
If no one has a question, I'll just make one comment because I just saw Liz's comment in the chat. But yeah, in Washington, we don't really have GALs, but there are, like, when we were talking about safety planning, that is something I'll consider, like getting other professionals involved who will have another level of eyes on a youth or a young person, not necessarily because I want them involved with DCYF, but there may be another mandated reporter or a case manager or probation officer that will have a kind of more eyes on a kid that adds a level of safety and accountability if there are ongoing concerns that for whatever reason the defense team can't report. And I think the marriage of social work and defense-based mitigation and social work is, we are supposed to meet the clients where they're at, and we are their stated interest, not their best interest. And so that's what we have to really focus on, even if it maybe makes us uncomfortable or we're like, oh, I really don't feel good about releasing or planning for this youth to go to a shelter or something like that. There are maybe other services or professionals we can get involved that will help mitigate any risk.
Good points. Any questions or thoughts or something you want to talk through? I appreciate everybody sitting with us and either reviewing or learning something new.
Maren, you just put your email in the chat to me, but if you wanted to share otherwise,
this is why I can't do both.
So
I'm going to put my email in the chat for everyone. If you have any other questions or things you want to talk through, I'm happy to address that.
And it is 1:30, so I am going to just say thank you, Maren, Molly, and Simmie, for all your work on this. Hopefully at OPD, we're trying to put together this as well as a training directed more at social workers and social service providers together to have as a resource available to you all on an ongoing basis. And we appreciate you participating in this today and hope that we can all have more support on our defense teams in the near future.